Welcome to today's webinar, the Sovereignty Challenge, AI, Diversification, and Commercialization, all about sovereignty and the challenges that we're facing, whether they be national or personal. Alberta stands at a historic crossroads because this is very much the focus today. For decades, the province has built extraordinary prosperity through natural resources, industrial expertise, engineering talent, and entrepreneurial ambition. Its vast energy reserves helped create one of the highest standards of living in the world and remain a strategic asset of enormous importance. Yet, prosperity alone does not guarantee resilience. The question confronting Alberta today that we'll be exploring through this webinar is not whether energy matters. It does. Nor is it whether Alberta should abandon the industries it built its success. It should not. The real question is whether Alberta can transform today's prosperity into tomorrow's resilience. This distinction matters because genuine sovereignty cannot be built upon a single resource, regardless of how valuable that resource may be, though that may be up for discussion. A province whose prosperity depends heavily upon forces beyond its control remains vulnerable, no matter how much political authority it possesses. So that's the background for the discussion. To help me through this topic, I've invited Robert Anders, Bill Jones, and Emerson Sorba, who for many of you require no introduction, although when I call them, I will ask them to give me a little bit of color as to why this topic is of personal interest. So gentlemen, I've shared with you a few questions, and I'm going to start out. Oh, and by the way, I've also asked Robert McGarvey, who was kind enough to send me an elaboration on the newsletter and his perspective, which is rich enough with his background in economics and history and in the relevance of intangible assets, that I think Robert's presence will be of value throughout the webinar as well. So gentlemen, the article argued that resilience is a practical expression of sovereignty. Do you agree that economic diversification may be more important to Alberta's future than constitutional or political debates about sovereignty? Okay, Emerson, I'm going to call on the youngest fellow in the group, give you an early start. Do you think that economic diversification is more relevant than all this political stuff about sovereignty and independence?
Yes. So first off, thank you very much for having me. And I always really enjoy these sessions and the philosophical nature partly of these conversations. Super quick background, born and raised in Alberta, in Edmonton, for the first 21 years of my life, lived in Britain for 10 years, in Montreal currently, but moving to the US currently to San Francisco for the AI side of things. So that's just a super quick background, but I pride myself on the frontier attitude of being in Alberta, which I think is unique within Canada. I think my gut reaction on the economic diversification side of things versus the political side of things is one is I'm averse to too much focus on grievance. And even though Alberta has legitimate grievance with Ottawa because of a lack of respect, despite Alberta giving more than its fair share to Ottawa, Canada is a very small place in the world. And to be successful in the world and to be sovereign in the world, you have to engage well beyond Canada. And that's been my sort of experience just being abroad for 10 years is Canada is a great place, but a really small place. And if Alberta or any place wants to be sovereign, i.e. to control its own destiny, then you have to engage with the wider world. So focusing on Ottawa, which is very slow, which doesn't respect you, that tries to create barriers, you're not going to have a lot of success engaging with it, is not very smart. Much better to go and find world markets, whether that's in the US, whether that's in Israel, in different parts of Europe, in Asia, where you can actually create value and provide value that makes you stronger. So that's my gut reaction, is that to be truly sovereign, you should not be dependent on a single place, and certainly not on a place that doesn't respect you, which is Ottawa. Go to the wider world and create value there. And then you don't need to focus as much on Ottawa.
One might argue that the impediment to sovereignty and to economic resilience is Ottawa itself. But I'm going to leave that aside. That just adds some more color. Rob, I see you raise your hand. You're muted right now. What's your view and what's your background?
Thank you. I was a member of parliament for over 18 years in Ottawa for first the Reform Party, and then the Canadian Alliance, and then the Conservative Party. Um, I think that yeah, it is good to take a broader scope and look at the world. I'm very sad that, for example, with regard to allies of ours like Germany, Japan, South Korea, were looking for liquefied natural gas when they realized that the Russian situation was turning sour with their invasion of first Crimea and then Ukraine as a whole. And yet our government in Ottawa said there was no economic case and turned that business away. Um, I look at coal. Alberta has a tremendous supply of coal, and yet Ottawa was in charge of this powering past coal alliance that wanted to phase out coal. We shut down our last coal-fired plant last year, and electricity prices have gone up as a result. I look at agriculture, which is also a big, not only in Alberta, but across the prairies. And you've got the Canada Food Inspection Agency, which is killing ostriches and going ahead and injecting some of the cattle with their experimental stuff and getting farmers to sign non-disclosure agreements because of the death of those animals. The wheat board was a great example where the Winnipeg Grain Exchange many moons ago was actually larger than the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and yet that was shut down. It's one of these inflection points, one of these pivot points in history. That was shut down to give a monopoly to the Canada Wheat Board and to Canada Steamship Lines and the Martin family to get that wheat over to China and sell it at sub-market prices. So there's all sorts of examples of where Alberta and the prairies could have developed world markets and been a bigger player than we are, but we were stymied by the government in Ottawa.
Okay, well, I alluded to that, and thank you. You reinforced it by citing a number of impediments for the development of a resource base that is exceptional. A strong Alberta would make a stronger Canada. Bill, your view.
There
Your,
we go. Exactly. Diversity and sovereignty are not separate boxes. They're one of the same. If you have constitutional sovereignty, it's just merely jurisdictional. Economic diversification is really about capacity. Do we have diversified revenue, industrial depth, markets, food security, technology capability, financial resilience? If we don't, then really sovereignty is a bunch of flag waving. So you need to bundle both together in a concept, and Alberta and even Canada. We can extend this to Canada. Canada is not that resilient as we think it is, and it suffers the same thing as Alberta. We can look at Alberta as a real test case on this, but we can expand it to Canada as a whole, and that's where we're starting to see that the American administration calling Canada a 51st state. That, as much as it is aggravating, is partially true. So Canada, as well as Alberta, really need to review itself and understand that Canada is just not a maple leaf flag, but are we really resilient in the tidal wave of the world?
well, it's interesting that if you have a strong resource base, we're talking about supply. There is no business without a consumer, and there is no business unless you can commercialize the assets you have. One of the issues with the newsletter address was the dilemma that Canada and Alberta seem to have of being adequately market focused and being competent in the commercialization of the resources that it has. So my second question, and I'll start this one out with you, Bill, again. Alberta's invested heavily in research, innovation, and technology development, yet why do you think the province has struggled to convert inventions and research breakthroughs into globally successful companies and industries? The survey research that we did for many years with the Alberta Council of Technologies noted that without an innovation ecosystem that's mature, you're not going to make headway. You can do all the inventing you want, you can do all the research that you want, but if you can't commercialize it, if a tree falls in the forest, nobody hears it. It didn't fall. So, Bill, what's your view? Do you think the province has struggled, and if so, why? And what might be done to resolve that?
Perry, you nailed it. There's lots of intelligence in Alberta. We do not have a lack of imagination in Alberta, and again, you can extend it to Canada as a whole. The gap is the commercialization. We celebrate our patents and our accelerators and our pilots and our research, and we announce them. But we do that without knowing who our customer is. What's the procurement pathway? What is the scale up execution of those products and how we can reach global markets? We are really bad at that. And not Alberta, it's even more present in Alberta, but it is a Canadian issue. We develop amazing things, and then the Americans or the Chinese or the Europeans market it and commercialize it. And do I have an answer to that? Yeah, we need to be better at commercializing our own intelligence. But that's a struggle. In my projects, I've found that Albertans and Canadians, we look down at the ground. If it doesn't come out of the ground, whether it's agriculture, oil, pipelines, or whatever, or minerals, we are lost. Americans in the world look up at the stars. They look at what is going to happen, and they invest in the future. We invest in things that are we can touch in the ground, and I think that is our failure. And so when we try to promote our technology, we don't find much investment opportunities or investors in Canada. They look at the ground and say in technology. And so it forces our innovators to go south or elsewhere to commercialize our own products that are developed here. We are not lacking intelligence in Alberta and Canada. We are really lacking the ability to commercialize that intelligence.
Okay. Emerson, anything you want to add here?
The main pieces I'd say, so for me, it comes back to the first piece, which is to diversify economically. You have to go to world markets. And of course, it's hard to develop things because, to develop technologies, it's just really hard. There's a huge amount of competition out there. For context, I didn't share this earlier, but I help run a deep tech investment company out of New York. It's Americans and Israelis. And we're backed by top American technologists, top people in Israel, and Americans and Israelis, alongside others, they're killers. They have a killer mindset, and their view is I will go up against you and beat you, and you have to be very strong to win in those competitive environments. And I think, to me, it's kind of an obvious thing, but Canadians are just very slow. And I found this since getting back to Canada after 10 years abroad is there's nothing happening on the Canadian side, or very little. Canadians are very focused on process. We're a government protection country where the view is government will do everything for us. Canadians don't take very much initiative overall, and it's hard to get anything done because Canadians are just super slow, fairly boring, and don't actually care about outcomes. That's my very frank view. So the conversation ends up being about, how do we sell to government? How do we do procurement kind of things? But the reality is, if you want to succeed, you have to go to global markets. And the key places that you have to be, if you're a talented person who wants to be the very best, the three best places in the world are New York, San Francisco, and Tel Aviv. So people naturally select because they get tired of their current environment. And to me, if the only thing that will change this is if we have something similar to what happened to Israel before it was a more economically advanced country, where Bibi came in and got rid of the socialist monopoly type system. Until that happens in Canada, people shouldn't be here if you're a talented young person, because there just isn't the opportunity. That's my frank view. So the core of it is, if you're a talented person, I guess even if you're living in Canada, you have to be spending your time in the States and in other places where there's actual competition. That's just, unfortunately, the reality of things.
The research that we did some years ago, and this was when we did a conference on analytics, big data in the cloud, and we invited a researcher from Israel to get a handle on why Israel was so able to commercialize and move at the speed it did. And she pointed out they were subjected to adversity. And in the face of adversity, they had no choice but to develop agriculture, to diversify their economy, to take initiative. Canada isn't slow, it's just comfortable. Rob, your turn.
Sure. I think the two themes in relation to that question are regulation and education. So, in Canada's case, we regulate, like you said, with process pipelines. I can think of where when I was working at the National Citizens Coalition, we used to use a company called T2P Overnight, which delivered mail within the downtown area code or zip code or postal code overnight, guaranteed for half the price of what Canada Post did. Canada Post came in and shut them down because they said they had a monopoly and nobody else could do it. So when you have just even Canada Post trying to shut down a mail competitor like that. In education, Jordan Peterson, great example, brilliant man, literally driven out of Canada because he didn't agree with pronoun and gender, policies, etc. Sheila Murphy was a big Tory here in Calgary. She ran the Henderson Business College. She was shut down by competition funded by the government with the university. So how can a private sector, outfit that trains secretaries for the oil patch compete when the government decides to throw in a whole ton of taxpayer money to shut her out of business? When I was at the UC and I represented it for close to 20 years as the member of parliament, they were focused on gender studies, gender expression, post-materialism, critical race theory, systemic racism, white privilege, pronouns, Aboriginal land claims, territorial acknowledgements, climate change. I mean, none of that stuff is about business or innovation or entrepreneurialism.
Well, there we are. Robert, I'm going to ask you and draw you in on the next question. I'm going to start out with you, and then I'll go to the panel itself. The article suggested that artificial intelligence is shifting competitive advantage away from information and toward human qualities such as judgment, trust, relationships, creativity, and leadership. And by the way, the impediments to commercialization that were identified in our survey work were leadership and the lack of mature networks. A relatively young province where mature economies often have networks able and to keep the decision making flat rather than hierarchical. But that's another story on how we mature. But in any case, Robert, do you agree, and how should Alberta prepare its workforce, businesses, and educational institutions for a transition now that we have artificial intelligence driving us as it is?
Well, I think one of the first things to realize, and obviously the area of my primary research is the transition in the capitalist economy from an industrial economy to something quite different, to a digital knowledge-based economy. And just some of the factors that play in there is that industrial economy, the best machines win. This very industrial mindset that was important. In this new economy, it's the ability to innovate and rapidly translate value into commercial opportunity. And so the core of that economy is intangibles, like data, like networks, like software, AI, algorithms, etc. And one of the big missing pieces is accounting. We don't account for these assets properly, therefore we lose them from an accounting point of view. We're much weaker because of the asset inventory in our businesses is much smaller than it should be. Therefore, it's just a chronic business failure. But so getting accounting right would help capital markets more readily access the key drivers of this knowledge-based economy, because capital flows through asset channels. And if you're not recognizing these new classes of assets, you're just putting impediments between savings and opportunity. So structurally, that I think is a big problem. But as you know, I've always blamed NAFTA as a primary driver of complacency in the Canadian economy. It's just too easy to send, oil in south, and that's a magnificent economy, and so you don't really need to rely on anything else. So, when you look at where innovation is taking place, it's in places where there is stress. Why is the Ukraine one of the great innovators in Marshall technologies? It's because they have to. Israel, the same story. The United States has it kind of built into their DNA, but Canadians, as you say, I think are complacent, slightly comfortable, too easy just to ride on the waves that NAFTA has kind of positioned Canada as, primary producers. So we and one of the primary products that we produce is technology. The secondary development of it is just let's just send it to the States, because that's what we do with everything else. So I think we're positioned in the global economy as a primary producer, and we have to. I think that's changing rapidly. We are now under stress, and I think we might see some major changes. That it's now urgent that we do this.
That stress that you referred to, we've commented on it frequently, is moving away from supply toward demand, and recognizing that we've got to shift from simply being a hewer of wood, et cetera, and supplier of resources, to one that becomes much more market oriented and much more appreciative of the relevance of humanity, of people, of markets, in order to survive. Bill, you want to jump in here?
Well, I don't think I can add much more to that, but that the challenge we have as far as Canadians, and it's been exposed by the other speakers, is somehow Canadians as pioneers in a wilderness have been dulled into complacency by looking to central government bureaucracies for their answers. I don't have an answer to that. The condition that created that has been over decades and decades and generations, and I struggle offering a solution. How do you wake up Canadians to be competitive in the world market, to be immune to the bureaucracy and the need for differential authority? Getting what I find within the bureaucracies, no one wants to take responsibility, hence the red tape. They don't want to sign the document, so they pass it on. Another person to look at it, but they have to sign it, and they don't want the responsibility, so they pass it down. And pretty soon you're 10, 15 people away, and no one wants to take the responsibility of signing. The first one that does, everyone else will sign, because the first guy signed is the one who carries it. So it seems to be a dearth of acceptance of responsibility. It's really hard, Perry, and your seminars are touching on this in every aspect, but I struggle to answer with a solution.
Well, before responsibility, you almost have to acknowledge that there is an issue, and when comfort is your primary driver. When I've talked to politicians, I said, we just don't want there to be any shocks. Therefore, we'll maintain the status quo. And Canada loves its institutions. I mean, CBC will go on forever. The post office will go on forever. Waiting lists will go on forever, until somebody finally says it's unacceptable. But Rob, you've been there. What do we need to do?
Well, there's so many times where Canadians kind of suffice with a government response, which is terribly inefficient, because you have to collect, 2.5 times the amount of taxes to be able to create a dollar, to subsidize something. So you have to collect $2.50 to subsidize something by $1. The Avro Arrow, why did Diefenbaker go ahead and bury those at the bottom of lakes? I remember I've had very competent people in the U.S. Air Force tell me that they thought it was a great innovation, and it all got vivisected, and those people left, went to the United States. Nuclear. Doug Harkness was a minister from here in Calgary want Canada to be a nuclear power. We certainly have the technical capability, Chalk River, etc. But we decided not to do that and rely instead on other people's long distance bombers and ICBMs and whatever. Supply management. If we actually had free trade, most of the dairy industry in Canada would be wiped out because it's literally grown so dependent on supply management. It's a sad scenario. I give kudos to Quebec that allowed their producers to do kind of their own thing and produce all sorts of innovative cheeses that are outside of the pasteurization process, and they have some unique product there. But Canadians kind of over rely on government to be the nanny for them. It's sad.
Some years ago, Rob, I was the director of privatization in the province of Alberta. It was probably after I'd been iced and was no longer an assistant deputy minister, but had the longest title in government, the director of privatization and funding reform, when no one knew even how to spell it. I thought it was an ideology, but over time I came to realize it was to give consumers choice. It wasn't about simply shifting government to corporations, but to recognize the value of the consumer at a time when we had plenty of supply. We just didn't have a recognition that the consumer, formerly a client in Roman times, one step above a slave, it was time to recognize that we had supply, we just didn't have a appreciation of the relevance of demand. So my next question is focused on that very topic. One of the article's strongest criticisms is that Alberta's innovation ecosystem focuses heavily on the supply side. Very much your point about what Canada's been doing in supply management. Research, startups, and investment. Always building the infrastructure above where the jobs are, at least the existing jobs, not the entrepreneurial future jobs, but pays insufficient attention to consumers and commercialization. Do you agree? I think we do, but I didn't set up the webinar simply to get agreement. But do you agree? And if so, what practical steps could governments, corporations, universities, public institutions take if they're even relevant to making the change? Because they're all in the status quo. They're all retaining the supply side management. They all want to dominate and maintain the system as it is because of its focus on supply. Our institutions, our governments, our not our corporations. What can be done to take and become better first adopters of Alberta-made innovators and innovations? Let's see. Robert, okay, go ahead, Emerson. You raised your hand.
I just want to first come back on a piece that Bill shared earlier about why are Canadians so passive. And this comes out of 10 years in the UK, where I helped to modernize one of the main UK geopolitical organizations and did my PhD at Oxford. So I have a good sense of the British system. And what I would say is Canadians, and I've realized this since coming back, we are fundamentally British. We are not American at all. And it comes back to how the country was founded. We were loyalists. We were not revolutionaries like the Americans who broke off. So our fundamental nature is attached to Britain. And what is Britain? Britain is slow. It's all about institutions. It's all about having a feudal lord that everybody sucks up to. That is fundamentally the Canadian mentality. It's about deference to government, deference to big corporations. That is, we are literally British. So what do we do to break that? And this, I think in the past, I thought this was a non-issue. But if I were the federal government, as crazy as it sounds, the single most important thing we could do to become sovereign is completely break the relationship with the monarchy. Say we are completely independent. Why? Because as long as we are connected to the monarchy, we symbolically are deferential. And who is the archpriest right now of this? Mark Carney. Because his wife is British, he's super British, he mandates a British S in federal government documents. There cannot be a stronger example of being un-American and uninnovative than that. So it's how do we break the British mindset, because we're not American at all. That to me would be a massive thing for us to do. Get rid of the connection to the monarchy. It's not just a symbolic thing. It's about economic diversification. So that's my first thought. And the second thought that comes back to it is, I think the questions, I almost question, Perry, the premise of the question, and that it's, to commercialize, you just have to go to where the markets are. It's unfortunately for Alberta and for Canada, we're a small population. We're 4 million people and 40 million people. It's go to the wider world, and that should be the mindset. And then how do we get people to do that? And Jordan Peterson, I think Rob was a great example, is he spent a lot of time outside of the country. We need to get more Canadians outside of the country at a young age to see the world, compete in the world, and then come back. And And Jeff, you shared in the comments, Canadians are really innovative, and I think we're some of the smartest people in the world. We're just kind of naive because we don't see enough of the world. We say that we're this globally minded country, but we're not. We're actually very insular. So the best thing to do would get young people to go to the wider world, see that actually we're really good as Canadians, and that should be the mindset. Not about Alberta markets, not about Canadian markets. It's about global markets because there is real demand for this kind of stuff. And then the question becomes, well, the federal government is a blocker, and it is, but I am very hopeful that Canadians, because of how bad things are going to get, will eventually have a come to Jesus moment, and that we will have a long term, that we will become a fundamentally conservative country. I think that we could end up seeing 10, 20 years of conservative government because Canadians realize how utterly stupid it is to keep voting in this same government that delivers no results. So I'm very hopeful about the direction of things.
Well, if adversity is a trigger for innovation, we may well have grounds for hope. Rob, you want to respond here?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on an experience that I had. So Ontario under Mike Harris was bringing in the Taxpayer Expenditure Limitation Act. So basically, if they were going to raise taxes in Ontario, it had to go to a public vote. So I and another Alberta political activist working in another MP's office attended this town hall that Tony Clement was at. And I was shocked by the response because being guys from Alberta involved in grassroots politics with the Reform Party, et cetera, at the time, when they made this announcement, when they were doing the town hall about it, I thought for sure half the crowd would say, awesome, great. And the other half of the crowd would say, why didn't you do it yesterday? What I was shocked by was that these weren't blue-haired, nose ring protesters types. These are the ones who voted for the Harris government. They were in that room. They were the supporters of the Conservative Party of Ontario. And they literally said, well, if you say it's good for us, then we'll accept that because we hired you to do this job. And if you think you need to raise our taxes, then you raise them. If you think you need to keep them the same or lower them, that's up to you. We hire you. That's your job. And I remember I turned to this other guy I knew from Alberta and I said, I can't believe this. But it just shows you that lineage from the United Empire Loyalists was very much alive and well in Ontario, 200 years later, that they were deferring to their government official about whether or not there should be a tax increase or not. Because I'm used to prairie populist politics and peasants and pitchforks, I was shocked by that response.
Good analogy, the Ontario and lemmings. Bill, your point.
I think that story really highlights the difference and the angst between Western Canada and Eastern Canada. Eastern Canada is the United Loyalists, and they shed blood. They shed American blood and Canadian blood on both sides of the border in defense of Canada. Whereas Western Canada, our relationship with our partner to the south has been solely on trade. Western Canada has never been at battle, let alone fight, let alone anything like that with our American friends. And I think that's where the separation and a lot of the angst inside Canada comes from, is Eastern Canada fought, Western Canada traded. And so I get disturbed every time when people say Canada believes X. It isn't that. It is Eastern Canada believes X. It has the political force to enforce it, and does so on the world stage. And Western Canada raises its little finger and says, "Well, that's not necessarily true," but we get yelled at and demeaned and shoved into the corner. So Emerson's point is quite correct. I mean, I've spent more than 30 years overseas on almost every continent on Earth, and he's very accurate about that. I found very interesting, the Americans own the world and Canadians run it. Everywhere I went, Americans owned the company, but Canadians ran the business. And it was very shocking to see that. For example, IBM Canada, so IBM, United States, simply deals with the United States. IBM Canada deals with Canada and every other place in the world. So Canada and our people and capability is a worldwide resource, but Canadians don't utilize it well. We do quite literally run the world. We don't own it, but we run it. But we don't know that, and we don't use it internally. And again, I reach back to Emerson. Rob and I have had till 2 a.m. conversations about this over and over again. But I struggle for an answer how we can, and the word might not be correct, but correct the Canadian mentality to understand that we really are a superpower in the world if we actually touch it.
We have a culture that seems to focus more on ideology than on pragmatism. Less talk. I use the metaphor often of ready, fire, aim. Canada is really good at ready, aim, and seems to be slow on taking action. It also has as a characteristic, it seems to have a culture that's anti-American. It wants to be independent, and therefore it feels to be independent, you have to not like, you have to resent, you have to tell your kids, we don't want to be America, even though they may not know what America is, other than it's a big, gigantic neighbor that could roll over and crush us in a minute and call us 51st state and probably orchestrate it if they really wanted to. That angst that seems to be the culture of Canada, to be anxious about the size of its neighbor. You can talk about history, but when I meet the anti-Americans, they're really not anti-American. They're just resentful of the fact that there's so much power south of us. How can we possibly be relevant? So I've got a wrap-up question. If we look ahead 20 years, I'm going to change the question a little bit. If we look ahead 20 years, what's your forecast of what Canada will look like and what Alberta will look like 20 years from now? I'm going to start out with Robert. Just because he's an outsider and give the rest of you a chance to think. He's going to take it right off the cuff. Robert, what do you think Alberta or Canada will look like in the next 20 years?
Well, I think the next 20 years are critical. And I think, as I was discussing earlier, I've been studying paradigm shifts in the economy. And this is very similar to the kind of 16th century transition. And it's amazing how small countries on the periphery who had no business of being successful, when they were put under stress, became very successful. Holland, England both rose, and Spain and France, those great powers, declined because in times of transition, you have to move rapidly to the new. And I would say that what Canada's future depends upon how carefully or how convincingly we can adopt to this new economy. And it is global, but it is founded with entirely different assets and core principles than the industrial economy. And if we get that right, Holland went from a soggy provincial backwater to the richest country in the world in 1 century, because they adapted rapidly to the new. And I think that's, you asked me what Canada's going to be like. It depends if we can replicate what I think is a major transition, the last major transition we made in World War II. We industrialized in a matter of 3 years. We became a major military industrial player under C.D. Howe. If we do that again, then, yes, Canadians, when they get in motion, are impressive to watch.
Okay, so you brought a force to the table that we have only alluded to briefly, and that is the world is in transition. We've been talking about the plight of Alberta, the plight of Canada relative to one another as impediments, impeding opportunity. But we're now in a potentially very different environment. This may be the very environment that brings that adversity to the table and forces us to rethink the way that we've been behaving in the past, to consider a new pathway to a new future. Bill, I'm going to ask you to jump in here.
I think in 20 years, Alberta will be more autonomous than it is, approaching its own sovereignty on a national scale. When we talk about Canada, again, we fall into a concept that Canada is a single entity with a same brain and all the things are working in the same direction. I don't see that. As I related, Eastern Canada and Western Canada have different histories, and that will create a separation between East and West. And I do see Alberta becoming more sovereign, more worldly focused, more independent from the Eastern bloc politically and economically, and will chart its own future. And it isn't because Albertans don't like Canadians. In fact, I think Alberta and the West are trying to protect what Canada is. And so it really isn't a divergence from Canada. It is that Canada in the East is moving away from what Canada was. So I think it will be.
You're portraying Alberta as playing a leadership role, not the negative, but leading Canada forward.
Correct. And it will be interesting to see if Canada follows that leadership or divests itself from it and goes its own way. I don't know. It can go either way, but I have seen that there is not a unified Canada. It has been fractured. I don't know if the fracture can be healed with glue, but there has been a fracture.
I saw that on my tour of Eastern Canada over the last week. I was quite surprised to learn how much anxiety there is in Eastern Canada with the continued erosion of their economies by the federal government. They talk about cod, they talk about how the fishing industry has been eroded as a product of regulations that have done nothing to prepare the East for some of the transitions that were necessary. So there seems to be some angst in various quarters aligned with, we've got to start thinking differently. Are we going to be a country of supply management, or are we going to become focused on markets and market opportunities, which you've been echoing, Emerson? So I'll let you have the next word.
Yes, and just being here in Quebec, there's not much happening. It's low energy, and you can see that things are not great, and people just don't work very hard here. And it's showing me, wow, Alberta, we really are frontier people. We have a frontier mindset where we build, and it is a distinctive thing, being an Albertan, spending a bit of time in the East, where Alberta is just so much different, which is an amazing thing. I think in terms of where the world will be, it really depends on US-China competition. And fundamentally, we're obviously on the American side, so our destiny is tied to the US. And I think for us, we are, and this goes back to Bill's point, we are the engine for the US. So I think the best possible scenario is we have a US that becomes stronger, stronger and stronger, and we become the engine with our resources, with AI, with many different things. It's powering the US. Alberta becomes stronger for that reason. And as competition intensifies between the US and China, and hopefully as the US emerges victorious, we then power a lot of the frontier parts of the world that emerge, whether it's Poland, whether it's Australia, different parts of Asia, some different parts of Europe. Canada can play a really big role in that. I think, connecting back to what I was saying earlier, I really think that the Liberal Party of Canada could become what the Labour Party in Israel was, that it becomes unelectable. I hope and pray that becomes the case. And a much larger defense force, and maybe new cities on the Canadian side as we become a more populous nation through Canadians rather than through new people coming to the country. So that's how I see it, as being an engine for the US. Also, and then back to this point about independence, breaking the relationship with the UK and being a truly independent Canada alongside us powering the US. That is what I hope.
Well, certainly you've reinforced the independent Canada, the stronger Canada, but you haven't used the word separation. I'm going to raise that when we open up discussion with the audience. But before I do, Rob, you have the last word as a panel, then I'm going to call on Robert.
Okay. Well, I see certainly a more devolved federation than what we have now. I think during COVID, we saw that Uttar Pradesh did things different than the rest of India because they didn't have the finances to buy the jab. So they went instead with a cheaper option and a better option, actually. I think what we saw with Texas and South Dakota as well in the US doing something different than the other states did, I think we'll see that grow in Canada, whether it's Alberta and Quebec or some others. I think you'll see more individualized pensions than what we have now, because what we have now is kind of a Ponzi scheme, which I don't think will bode well in the future. I think Alberta and other places will probably do more tax collection, whether it's corporate taxes or more. Provinces will want more say over immigration. Quebec and Manitoba have started that process, but Alberta's chomping at the bit, and I'm sure others will as well. I think you'll see provinces take on more of environmental regulations, because whether it's Newfoundland not wanting to be messed with in terms of their hydro, or Quebec with their hydro, or Newfoundland with the fisheries, or Alberta with oil and natural gas, and the list goes on. I think we'll see more free trade. Despite what's going on in the US right now with regard to that. Trump at one point actually offered Justin Trudeau totally free trade, but Justin Trudeau chose to use those 2 hours to lecture him on feminism instead. So think about that. I think we'll see more privatization in healthcare, just because the demands of an aging population, and the fact that in Alberta it went from $10 billion before Notley to $20 billion a year at the end of Notley. We're going to just the sheer demands are going to mean that we're going to have more and more privatization, I think, like Europe does. And I also think unionization levels will drop. Quebec is at 42% unionization. Alberta is at 8%. The growth in the US is in the right to work states, the voluntary unionism states. I think we'll see that trend continue across North America.
Well, this has been very healthy. I'm going to note, Robert, before I call on you, for the audience at large, one of the things that's noteworthy in this discussion, not once has anybody mentioned separation. Not once has anyone mentioned the separatists. We've had a discussion about sovereignty without having to discuss separation. We've had a discussion about how to get stronger without having to run away. This is what I was hoping, and this is what I have been hoping a referendum would trigger, is a healthy discussion about what Canada is, a healthy discussion about what Canada could be, and the role that Alberta can play in it. And gentlemen, Rob, Bill, Emerson, I'm not saying goodbye yet because we've still got a few minutes to go, but I want to thank each of you for staying focused on the discussion of sovereignty without having to raise the emotional element of separation. It's not necessary in order to achieve sovereignty. In order to be strong, you don't have to run away. Robert, your turn. What do you want to add here? And by the way, I'm opening up this to the viewers, so show of hands gives me some indication of some comment to make or contribution as well. Robert, go ahead.
Sovereignty is very, very difficult to achieve because it requires international recognition of your sovereign state. And I don't know anybody who's at this point prepared to recognize sovereign Alberta except the United States for obvious reasons. And I think the other side of that coin is that unlike Quebec, Alberta is a creation of the federal government. And the transfer of mineral rights, which is obviously a key element in this whole process, those were transferred to Alberta from the federal government on the basis that we were a province in Canada. Now, if the gloves come off and push comes to shove, and if I was the federal government, I'd grab those resources legally. Then you're in a real. Then the gloves come off fully. So there's no real recognition apart from the United States in a sovereign Alberta, and legally, it's a nightmare, and it would only be settled militarily. This would be a shooting war.
Oh, well, I think there are those that have their not just their elbows up, but their weapons warm. Okay, audience, we've had some discussions I can see in just the chat on the side. Jeff Kramer, you've raised a few interesting points. Do you want to make a comment here?
Now, I think that to me, this discussion sounded very one-sided. Now, my background, I used to live in Calgary, and I voted for Rob when I lived there, and I voted for Stephen Harper in another part of Calgary.
You don't have to apologize.
But I think that Canada has recognized that the mistakes that Justin Trudeau's government has made were mistakes, and that we should be, as Carney puts it, an energy superpower, both clean and conventional energy. And I think that's the direction we're heading. I think we're going to start shipping natural gas out of Churchill, maybe even oil. I think that we're going to see these other pipelines being built. We're going to see, Trump approved the, what's left of Keystone XL. It sounds like we're getting another oil pipeline to the West Coast. So these things are happening. These are all positive signs that, Alberta is being heard. And the other thing that I think is happening is Eastern Canada is developing too. Newfoundland's working on another large Hibernia type project. There's natural gas to be, drilled out of Nova Scotia, and those are projects that I think are people are looking at and trying to get developed. Plus the stuff that I write about in my book. I think there's a huge potential for green energy and artificial intelligence here in Canada. Elon Musk talks about the economy 10xing in the next 10 years. So we're all going to benefit from that, and Canada can definitely play a big part in the artificial intelligence scene. I mean, Jeffrey Hinton, of course, and Dr. Schaefer, who you've had on here, are well known in the AI industry and leaders, and I think there's a lot of potential for that under Evan Solomon's leadership in this new ministry for artificial intelligence and compute. Anyway, so those are my two bits. I see a much more positive future. I think that Alberta will stay in Canada, and it quite likely will have a larger voice, just like Quebec still has a big say in Canadian politics after their referendum. Maybe Alberta will get a bit of that spotlight too. Regarding productivity, of course, Alberta has benefited hugely by well-educated people from the rest of Canada, young people coming to work here. And then that also explains part of the reason why Quebec is performing so poorly, is a lot of the young people are following the money. Alberta is the land of opportunity at the moment. And so that's where they're heading. But my family, I was born in Quebec. My family moved out here in the 70s. So I'm living.
We may be seeing the very transition that we think is in the future underway, regardless of what you might think about the Liberals and regardless of what you might think about Carney and his heritage. Mm-hmm. We have heard about Alberta or Canada as an energy superpower, which is quite a reversal on positions that had been heralded some years ago, where energy meant oil sands, energy meant tar sands, energy meant dead ducks, energy meant climate change. We may be making the very turn that we need to see to respond to global markets with the resources that we have, which would be a change in itself. Instead of burying our heads in the sand, waking up to the fact that we're in demand. And it's about time we responded. Emerson.
Just a quick follow-up on Jeff's point. Carney is liked. I do not believe that he's going to get anything done. And the context, and I've shared this on a previous panel, and maybe Rob and other conservatives forgive me on this. When I moved to Canada about a year and a half ago, in early February, I got an unexpected note from Diana Carney and then Mark basically saying, "I hear that you're back. Mark needs help. Can you help him?" And I then wrote literally half of his policy. They had no policy apart from the axe the carbon tax piece, and my heart was beating like crazy before I got back saying yes, because I'm a conservative. And I thought, okay, I've known Mark for 10 years. I'm a conservative. What do you do? And they had no policy at that point, nothing. And this is 3 weeks before the end of the Liberal leadership race. And I got a lot of it done, like drove a lot of the process, and then wrote to Mark after and said, you need to bring more non-Trudeau people into your team, because I was the only non-Trudeau person, like without exaggeration, And of course, he got back and was extremely unhappy with that. And my read, and then I said, I'll be on the conservative side after this because I'm conservative. But my fundamental view, and it still is the same thing, and it's a hard one to maintain because it does seem like things are happening, is that the team is the same team from the past. Carney is different than Trudeau because he's a technocrat, and Canadians like it because we're liked in the world again. But the team is the same. And to me, it's like if it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. That is my fundamental read. So even though things seem good right now and his opinion polls are high, I do not think that these things are going to get done because the people on his team and Mark are literally not doers. They have no track record of delivery over the past 10 years, and Carney doesn't really either. He was not liked in Britain, including by the finance sector, because he didn't do anything. So my view is eventually Canadians are going to say, okay, we're done with this experiment. Poilievre, I think, has a good shot. That's my read. It's a hard one to maintain right now, Jeff, because of his polls, but I really do not believe that they're going to get things done because they're fundamentally not doers. They're talkers.
Well, in short, you're picking up on the metaphor that if we continue to be ready, aim, 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 we will maintain the status quo and be where we are today. If we have leadership that is ready, fire, aim, we're ready to take on the future. And until we get action, many are sitting on the fence waiting for Carney to demonstrate which side of the fence he's going to sit on. Is he a person of action or a person of aim and just a lot of talk? Okay, Rob, anything you want to add here as we get into wrap up?
Well, I've certainly got my thoughts on Mr. Carney. I don't have any personal experience with him, but any guy who can look down a camera lens and talk about allocating $150 trillion with a T to the green agenda, or taking on $1 trillion of European debt that we don't need through American, kind of backed securities, etc. Those are recipes for trouble. That's a lot of money. That's more than his money. It's more than Canada's money he's talking about. Or somebody who's in favor of central bank digital currency, and sold off our gold bullion to back our Canadian dollar. So I think his honeymoon will wear off, and I think people will realize that it's a lot of control, and it's like a slicker, more Teflon version of Trudeau, but that's about what you're getting. Maybe.
Well, it's about the retention of power. Yeah. I mean, if power is what the game of politics is all about, and there is a belief that power still resides in that Laurentian retention of power in the East, then we will get the same old, same old. We've got just a few more minutes. I want to give the audience Bogdan or Andre, others that are attending. Haley, any hands up there? Anything that I haven't responded to? I haven't seen any hands up, but any other questions out there that you'd like to ask the panel, or comments you'd like to make yourselves? Okay. I think we're Haley, anything? I just see you've put your video on. Any comments you want to make, Haley?
I have a question for the panel and for you, Perry. You asked the question, Perry, where do you see us in 20 years? I'd like to look backwards. And I want to ask, because I've known you for almost 20 years now, and I want to look backwards and say, what could we have done 20 years ago? And why are we not focusing on our mistakes then to inform the path that we want to take? Because I know those mistakes. Surely you all know those mistakes too. Why are we here now?
Well, you and I can chat about this offline, but I'm going to give others a chance. Robert, why are we where we are today? Why did we not see the mistakes along the way and adapt and adjust?
Well, as I write in my book, we fell into a woke frame of mind. And this is a very, very dangerous philosophical hole to fall into. All of a sudden, society in general is guilty of heinous crimes against minorities, and is responsible for the fact that inequality exists. And so you run down a rabbit hole that leads you to the very issues everyone has been describing here: the lack of faith in development, the lack of faith in the culture as it is. And the Trudeau government, the 10 lost years were Canada was the most woke nation on the earth. There wasn't anyone as bad as that. Britain was pretty close, and I take your point. But I think the electorate has awoken. I think they wanted a conservative. They didn't like Polly Evans, so they elected Carney. But they want conservative policies, and they're going to get them. And if Carney doesn't deliver, well, someone else will. But the tide has definitely turned on that whole philosophical point of view. So I think that what's happened the last 20 years, we have stumbled into a negative frame of mind, and the electorate has snapped. I think, very carefully, I think good things are going to happen from here on in, but we'll wait and see.
So the emergence of the attention economy was certainly driven by fear. And the fear was perpetuated by this belief that we are all victims. And the federal government really traded on that. Whether
classic romanticism,
being a woman, whether it was being indigenous, whether it was being somehow or another, every Canadian had to feel they were a victim and that government was going to be their daddy and their savior. If we don't wake up from that, if we don't become a country not of aiming and not of blaming, but of action, we got trouble. Now, next week, David Redman will be featured, and I invite all of you that are here today to join me in that discussion with David, because David takes it even further. He's not negative, but he does say if Canada does not wake up, it's a failing nation. We have an opportunity in the face of this adversity, all of what we've pointed to change our way and to make a difference. And the optimism, and I felt optimism today. We pointed out to the problems, but we also pointed out the ways to get out of this. And it's not about heralding the past, but recognizing the errors, as Haley has noted, of our past and taking initiative to make a difference in the future. We've talked about Israel and how it responded to adversity to become a nation of entrepreneurs and innovators. We've talked about Canada, a place of incredible intelligence, of world-class educational institutions, of a high level of capital accumulation and debt. Can Canada wake up? Stay tuned. We'll talk about that next week.
Okay.
So that's our wrap up for today, Randall. I will thank Robert Anders. I will thank Emerson. I will thank Bill. I hope you'll join us next week. I have David right now as a single, as an interview, but I invite each of you to be present, because I think the interview with him will be enlightening and a furtherance of this conversation. So we're now into an after party.